One thing about all of the Abbey Road plugins that Waves are making, modeling, and releasing, from the J37 to the Red to the TG stuff to now to the Abbey Road plates, it allows people an ability to, for lack of a better word, use this equipment, which only exists in one place in the world, that you're not going to get an opportunity to really use. But you know those sounds and you know what that does to whatever musical information you put into it. I think that it also helps remind people about the importance of the history of record making, how we got to where we are now, educate people on where all this stuff came from before that knowledge is lost. Because the people that created the red desks and created the TGs, they're the ones who really made a lot of what we do possible. For me, I think that they add an extra element of musicality and an extra element of realism and depth to whatever I use them on that I feel is kind of lacking in a lot of other plugins. Even though I've never had the luxury of recording at Abbey Road, so much of that equipment and those rooms and those plates, the chambers and all that stuff, are really, I'm really aware of them from all the records that came out of that recording studio over the years. And to me, like, those are still the records that we aspire to, match sonically. The detail that Waves puts into their plugins, I find, really does allow me to kind of explore the outer reaches of what it would do under extreme conditions in the way that I would normally if it was analog. Like, it's not uncommon for me to patch a number of different fuzz boxes together into an amp and then just see what sort of destruction occurs. And, perfect example is how the Beatles chained two preamps together in order to get that crazy distorted guitar sound in Revolution. It's like you sit here and you go, wow, how do they do that? And then we find out it's like, oh, they're just doing stuff that they were not supposed to do. So for me, the ability to do that with the Waves plugins, I find really interesting. The Red preamps and EQs have a completely different thing. I tend to use those a lot on more sort of orchestral things or strings or stuff like that have got a real sort of lush quality to it, like Warm. And I guess because they were tube based, that kind of makes sense to me in a way. And the TG desks were solid state and they're a little harder, I wouldn't say harder, but they're more punchy and they're kind of like the transients kind of come through faster. And, I like them on drums and vocals and things like that, where I can really kind of feel the transients come through. And the EQs are completely different too. Like the top end on the TG has got a great sort of sheen to it, but the low end on the Red sounds really great as well. I tend to use the Red a lot on vocals too, because it's got the way it sort of saturates and drive on it is really special. And the TG 1 2 3 4 5, the built-in limiter and compressor, which I'm a huge fan of, which is based around their version of the Fairchild, is great on so many things. Again, it's a great thing. You can really hit hard and it just sort of puts it where it needs to be and it stays there in a great, and adds nice harmonic sort of quality to it. But yeah, I use those all the time. I feel like that's the thing. Like, you really feel that there's a history in these plugins. You feel like that they were built by somebody with a lot of love and care and thought, and things you take for granted, like, the EQ points on the TG, they're there because they're musical EQ points. They make sense. It's not necessarily mathematically where they should be, but it's because they were like, you know what, it sounds better here. Don't know why. Doesn't matter. What matters is, like, let's put it there because it makes sense. You really feel the history, I think, of where these great pieces of equipment came from, and the care and detail that Waves goes to model them, I think, is a great testament to how important these pieces of gear are and how musical they are and how detail and thought that has gone into creating these pieces of gear. With the TG and the Red consoles, those plugins, them modeling the amount of noise, the drive, the distortion, with the Abbey Road reverb plates, the crosstalk between the stereo sides, all these things that really do add up to making an element of realism and an element of musicality to it that doesn't normally exist in a lot of other plugins. They, when it saturates a certain way, the harmonic sort of content goes up. The harmonic distortion creates this other element of musicality to it, which I find really, interesting. and to me makes it more sort of three-dimensional, more real, and more sort of legitimate.